your technical knowledge that I alluded to before. And this is all under time pressure.
Yeah.
And for me, it's very similar to what I said earlier about students at university, where they have to write exams and they feel the pressure unduly, maybe because the assessment is requiring them to also be proficient in the language, to read quickly, to read properly, and also maybe explain. They need to explain. If there isn't an actual lab exam on, let's say, R, then they would be required to state what they did or what they would do. And that's very difficult for people to explain if it's language as their second.
Without just kind of doing the computation.
Exactly. So, those things. But that's why you have to have a level of comfort, okay, with the exam conditions as well as the application software like Microsoft Office suite of applications, so that you do not let those stand in the way of making your message appropriate for your audience. You don't let that stand in the way of you understanding what the examiner wants for that scenario. So those are the things that hold students back from doing well in this exam. And the examiner cannot take that into account when they are assessing your contribution, your draft or submission.
Yeah, that's true. I think it was something that students struggle with, from what I've seen, having marked on the technical side of N211, is they struggle with being concise as well. They tend to put so much detail in because they want to give this like actuarial rigor, and sometimes not understanding that that's not what your audience requires. If your audience is your friend or your grandmother or someone who's not an actuary, as much as you as the writer might find it intriguing that if you run different scenarios or there's all these different outcomes, they maybe just want you to highlight the different outcomes and say, these are the risks of taking each one, instead of unpacking the whole methodology that you sort of undertook in order to get to those endpoints. And I think students forget that. But why do you think students struggle with this? I mean, you talked about why, like certain things that they struggle with, but also I think they don't also see it as a subject that is easy to pass or easy to undertake, because it's not as easy to say how you can be successful in it. There's some sort of, if you were good at your technicals, you're going to now be good at communications. So can you just unpack like a student's experience of N211? Maybe that's a broader kind of question.
So thank you for that, Margie. I understand exactly where the students may be coming from if they have English as a second language, because this will make it doubly harder for them.
Mm-hmm.
But those students remarkably know that they have a disadvantage, so they work harder at everything else, and they also work hard at perfecting their language. So it comes down to even people who are very fluent in English and very good, and then using language at a high level, they struggle because maybe they don't take the exam seriously.
Yeah, they're like, it's something
I do all the time. I write all the time. I read all the time. I'm emailing at work constantly, or I'm at university. I'm emailing all the time. I have to write reports and hand in things. But those candidates who make the assumption that they're ready for it haven't really looked at it carefully, because there will still be certain requirements, and also they won't practice enough. So they forget that if you're not being assessed, you will spend a lot of time to refine your document, and you think that maybe it'll be fine for you to write an email in an hour and a half. You get into the exam situation and suddenly it's not enough time.
Yeah.
Because you haven't actually planned how you're going to do the exam. You haven't set out that each question you need to structure well, and you need to answer to what the examiners ask. To the examiner's notes are very, very important. So I just want to reiterate then that that if English is not your first language, you will need to work harder, and that's hard for you, and I really empathize with you. But it means that you're going to fill the gap yourself. Working harder means reading more, writing more. And the other thing is you need to recognize and reflect on your technical competency, both in terms of the concepts we mentioned earlier from your actuarial degree, and others like the Excel and PowerPoint and so on. And I don't believe you can ever read or write enough to be ready for an N211 exam. What you need to be aware of in the N211 exam is what the purpose is of the communication and what the examiner's notes have to reveal to you, and that you actually confine yourself to the world that the examiner's given you.
And don't kind of draw on all your experience. You actually say, this is a scenario, here are the parameters, let me stick to what's actually been asked.
Exactly, and you mentioned it earlier in your experience as well as a marker that was coming in. So I think that you also said that students feel comfortable. Students feel comfortable, I should say, taking this exam when there is a technical question, because they've always done well on the technical side.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that what they do is they forget that they're now talking to a different audience, and they're not talking to the examiner to say, I know this stuff. That's not the requirement. The requirement is to bring it down to the level that's appropriate for the audience.
Yeah.
And it could be one person, it could be your RAN, or it could, and which it was actually, last year's exam was based on questions from your GRAN about inflation and CPI. And
yes, I remember that. So I think one thing that I also want us to talk about is the benefits on the skills that you build in N211. I think I really enjoyed the course when I was at university. For me, it was like a breath of fresh air, because it was the first sort of non-technical subject we had done. And because I am fairly linguistic, I actually really enjoyed having to explain, as I love teaching. So for me, it was an extension of that interest. But then when I got to the workplace and I worked at product design and I was writing reports and product specs, that's when I started realizing actually how important the skill was, because the people who were reading the reports or reading the product specs were not actuaries. And there were often questions from people when they would read a product spec that I'd written, being like, what do you mean? Like, what is this that you mean? And I realized that is actually the place of N211, is that actuaries don't work in silos. You work with people that are not actuaries. And so being able to communicate in detail and still relay a message without confusing the person you're engaging with is so important. And as a teacher and a lecturer, etc., obviously those things have become increasingly sort of front of mind for me. But that skill set is unbelievably important. And so I don't think the inclusion of this in the actuarial sort of exam suite can be undermined to any degree, because it's all of them kind of are underpinned by N211. And something I also realized, and I don't know if you resonate with this, is that if you do well in N211 in communications for actuaries, it helps you with your later exams. It helps you with your F100s and with your fellowship papers, also actuarial risk management, because all of those are written.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're writing very technical. There, your audience is an actuary that's marking it, but you still are writing. And so that ability to be concise and to stick to a point and to have some sort of thread to your reasoning, especially in like your fellowship papers where you're given case studies, etc. I think that the skills that I developed in N211 were invaluable in actually then qualifying.
Absolutely. And in fact, in a recent meeting with the exam setter for A311 and the education executive, the exam setter said that A311 and N211 are like gatekeepers in a way. And what we mean by that is that this is going to signal that you are able to operate at a level that is acceptable as an actuary.
Sure.
Outside of...
It's like a vetting process.
It is, yes. Outside of the exam itself. But the exam is the only thing we have to assess that, because you can't be in the workplace to see how you're going.
Yeah, we don't have longitudinal data where we're sort of like looking at you day on day, kind of seeing how you are.
Or even in practice.
Yeah.
So these are all written. So that is why it's so hard. I encourage people to improve their written skills and to take confidence from the fact they're very good on the ground, they're very good in the meetings. But the only way that the profession can assess everybody is through the exams to see if they have those, if they're applying those skills. And I'm really pleased that you've seen a link between N211 and the later exams, because that's the whole reason why I established the Matters of Mind now, as it is called, to try and bridge a gap of being able to draw across, for example, in Matters of Mind, it's articles. So eventually you start seeing patterns, or you start seeing the link across fields, that the risk is everywhere, how they're managing it in this specialist area, what is the impact of climate change in this area. And so these things are important. A311, you're asked to draw, factors across the various chapters into a question. And in N211, you're being tested on any scenario. And in which case, for any scenario, you need to have general knowledge, and you need to be able to say, well, these are how the principles would work in this instance.
Yeah, I think that interconnectivity is a very important point. And I think you only really start seeing that from N211, A311, your communications and your actuarial risk management. Because I think the other subjects, because prior to that, they're all very sort of specific technical subjects, I think sometimes students struggle to see how they're linked. And then you get to a higher level, and it's supposed to integrate. And I think students find that difficult because they just want to know, like, what are the parameters of what I need to know? And it's not as simple as that as you get towards getting your designation as an actuary. And that is the point, right? Because an actuary has to be able to solve problems regardless of sort of the parameters that are given to them. And I think that is a very difficult thing. I think there's so many questions popping into my mind right now. But one thing I wanted us to touch on before we end was, I know that you're also involved in the mentoring programs at the Actuarial Society of South Africa. And I think I also just wanted to talk about your view of how important that is, and that role in helping students or supporting students in their end goal of becoming actuaries. I would love your view on that, just because it's something we touched on last season, but so many students don't leverage that as a means of support, and it's something I want to sort of spotlight a bit more.
That's fantastic. Thank you for mentioning that. In amongst all of this, I haven't said it explicitly, and I'm going back to my two favorite words, explicit and implicit, and I'm always trying to make the implicit more explicit. And what I haven't said is that self-reflection is an incredible tool for a professional, and more so for the actuary. And at an early stage, actuarial students are introduced to the control cycle. Actuarial control cycle, I should say, which seems counterintuitive because it's not something that you discovered for yourself. But what is intuitive is that we learn through experience, and if we don't reflect on that experience, we won't be able to learn. So the mentoring program is a self-reflective process, and it really asks both the mentee, and it asks of the mentor as well, to get the mentee to consider what they're doing that's working, what they're doing that's not working, and to unpack all the components that go into being successful in getting through your exams. And you have to look at your whole self for that. And you have to be honest about your approach to learning, and whether or not you have you've set the boundaries, and you've actually taken that on for yourself and committed to yourself that you're going to study. And so it's not just the start of registering for exam and the end point of writing that exam. There are many dots in between that will be connected. And as a student, you need to can it topmost in your mind this objective that you would like to conquer that exam, and what are the things that need to be put in place for that. So the Advancing Actuaries program really allows for close inspection of what you bring to this commitment that you've made to yourself to do this exam. And often it's a wish list and not a dedicated plan. And this is what is exposed, I should say, in the relationship, because your mentee your mentor has given of their time to
Yeah.
be with you, to understand your struggles so that they can assist you, or that they can lead you and you find, more importantly, you find a way that works for you, that you've done